The castle bells tolled in the grey November dawn, but no one emerged from the chapel doors. The knights were gone, swallowed by the mist that clung to the mountains beyond the eastern ridge, and they would not return. Eleanor stood at the ramparts, her white knuckles gripping the cold stone, watching the last trace of dust settle on the road. Behind her, she could hear the other women beginning to understand what this silence meant. It was a silence that would last 3 centuries, a quiet so profound it reshaped the entire world they inhabited. This is not a tale of triumph or heroic return. It is not the story you have been told, the one that ends with banners unfurled and victorious warriors descending the castle stairs. This is the story of the women left behind, the ones whose names were never inscribed in chronicles, whose struggles were never immortalized in tapestries. This is the story of how an entire civilization of women learned to survive, to thrive, and ultimately to forge a new world when the men they had been promised would return never came home. The year was 1247, though most of the women at the castle measured time differently, by harvest, by birth, by the turning of seasons marked in their bodies and their work. The Knights' Council had been deliberating in the great hall for 7 days and nights. Eleanor had served them wine while they argued, their voices rising and falling like a tide of male certainty. She had heard fragments: holy war, distant lands, religious fervor, divine calling, honor, conquest. She had heard the word brief used repeatedly, always with confidence, always with the kind of certainty that men possess when they speak of journeys they do not have to complete. Her husband, Sir William, was among them. She had been married to him for 6 years, a union arranged when she was 16, and he was a man of 30 whose face was weathered by sun and campaign. She had borne him 1 son, a boy of 3 with his father's dark eyes and stubborn jaw. That son, young Edward, was playing in the courtyard with other children when the final announcement came. Eleanor watched from the tower window as William appeared in the bailey, his armor already being polished by his squire, his sword being sharpened. He looked neither happy nor sad. He looked, she thought, the way he always did when the world began to organize itself according to male purpose, inevitable. The women gathered that evening in what they called the solar, though it was really the only room where wives, widows, daughters, and servants could speak freely without male ears overhearing. There were 43 women in the castle, ranging from the aged widow of the previous lord to a girl of barely 12 who had been brought as a scullery maid. Eleanor was not the highest ranking among them. That honor belonged to Margaret, the Castellan's widow whose husband had died 15 years prior. But Eleanor was young enough to carry strength, old enough to carry credibility, and she had always possessed something that others seemed to lack, the ability to see clearly what others were too frightened to acknowledge. "They're truly leaving," said Catherine, wringing her hands. She was the wife of the blacksmith, though her father had been a knight. "All of them?" "All of them," confirmed Margaret, her voice like steel. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair braided in the old fashion, and eyes that had seen enough of life to be unmoved by fresh tragedy. "I received word from my brother this afternoon. The decision was finalized. They march at dawn." "For how long?" asked young Anne, her voice small and frightened. She had been married only 8 months, her belly just beginning to show the child she carried. "When will they return?" No one answered immediately. Eleanor watched the other women's faces, saw how they processed the question, and understood that they already knew on some level what she was beginning to understand as well. The men had spoken of a crusade, of reclaiming sacred lands, of a righteous war. Wars like that did not end in a season or even a year. Wars like that ended when they ended, which meant they ended when enough men were dead that the survivors gave up, or when divine will shifted, or when the world forgot why it had started them in the first place. "The Lord promised to send word," Margaret said finally. "They have established the route. Messages will come when they reach the ports in the south. We must believe in God's providence and in the capability of our men." It was the right thing to say, and everyone in the room knew it was a lie. Not about God's providence, perhaps, that was a matter of faith, but about the messages, about the promises, about the notion that this departure could be anything other than permanent, at least as far as the women in that room could control. Eleanor looked at Margaret and saw something shift in the old woman's expression, a tiny crack in the certainty, a moment where her eyes betrayed that she too knew the truth. She had been here before. The previous lord, Margaret's husband, had left for a crusade when their youngest child was born. He had not returned. She had waited, and then she had stopped waiting, and then she had learned to lead. She had managed the estate through drought and plenty. She had negotiated with the bishop. She had made decisions that were meant to be made only by men. And slowly, so slowly that no one noticed it happening, those decisions had become simply the way things were done. The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn. Young Edward was sleeping between her and the cold stone wall, his small body tucked against hers for warmth. The room was dark, and for just a moment she could pretend that William was still sleeping on his side of the bed, that the day was ordinary, that nothing had changed. Then the castle bells began to ring, and the pretense shattered. She rose and dressed carefully, because this was a public moment and she would be watched. She braided her hair and covered it with a simple veil. She smoothed down her kirtle. She checked that Edward's clothes were clean and his face was washed. Then she took his small hand and walked down to the courtyard where the knights were assembling. William was there on horseback, his armour catching the first grey light of morning. His squire held his shield and his lance. He looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between affection and distance, as if he was already leaving in his mind, already travelling the roads toward whatever destiny he imagined awaited him. "You'll care for the boy," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Eleanor said, "and you'll obey the castellan in all matters of the estate." "Yes." "Good." He reached down and briefly touched her cheek with his gauntleted hand. The metal was cold. "I'll send word when we reach the coast." Eleanor didn't ask when he would return because she already understood that he didn't know, and perhaps more importantly, she was beginning to understand that it didn't matter. She had already begun in that moment the transformation from wife to widow. Not formally, not yet, but spiritually the transformation was already underway. "Protect him," William said, gesturing to Edward with his eyes. "He's a son of mine." Eleanor wanted to say something cutting, something that would pierce the veil of duty and propriety that separated them. She wanted to say that she had been protecting the boy since before he was born, that protecting him was the only real work she had ever done, that his existence and his welfare were written into her bones, in ways that William's honour and William's destiny could never be. But she said nothing. She simply nodded, and then William turned his horse toward the gate. The knights departed in a column, their armour and weapons shining in the pale morning light. Eleanor watched with Edward held against her hip, his small fingers tangled in her skirt. Around her, other women stood silent, some crying quietly, others staring with the blank expression of those who have been struck and are waiting to feel the pain. When the last knight disappeared beyond the gate, when the dust had settled and the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the normal sounds of the morning, the birds, the wind, the servants beginning their daily work, Eleanor turned and walked back inside. She had a son to feed, work to do, a life to build in the space that men had abandoned. She did not know then how long that life would stretch, how many seasons would turn, how many customs would be upended and traditions rewritten. She did not know that she would become the most powerful woman in the county, or that her choices would ripple outward through generations, or that the world would eventually forget that there had ever been a time when the women in the castle were subordinate to absent men. She only knew in that moment that the bells had stopped ringing, and the silence that followed was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of beginning. The first weeks passed in a strange suspension, as if everyone was holding their breath, as if at any moment the knights would ride back through the gates, admitting that it had all been a terrible mistake, a test of faith that they had now passed and could therefore abandon. The women maintained all the rituals of a castle with an absent lord, the formal dinners, the prayers, the careful accounting of grain and livestock. But even as they maintained these rituals, they began almost imperceptibly to modify them. The kitchens, which had always been ruled with an iron fist by the master cook who served at the pleasure of the knights, slowly began to operate differently. Eleanor noticed it first when she was helping to prepare the evening meal. The cook, a gruff man named Thomas, who had been at the castle for 30 years, was consulting with Margaret about what should be served. Not asking precisely, but consulting. Margaret was suggesting herbs from the garden, asking about the supplies of dried meat, wondering if they might try something different with the fish that had been caught in the river. The knights always preferred it prepared simply, Thomas said, but there was no conviction in his voice. The knights are not here, Margaret replied, and something in the tone of her voice, not cruel but matter-of-fact, seemed to settle something. They were not here, and therefore different choices could be made. The changes accelerated as the first season turned into the second. A dispute arose between two of the servants about the allocation of rooms in the storage building. In the old days, such a dispute would have been brought before the Lord's representative, who would have made a swift judgment based on rank and precedent. Instead, the dispute was brought to Margaret, who listened to both sides, asked questions, and made a decision that seemed to satisfy everyone. It was not a decision anyone would have expected a man to make. It involved considering the feelings of both parties, the practical circumstances of their lives, and some notion of fairness that went beyond simple hierarchy. But it worked. Eleanor found herself drawn into this new structure. She began to attend the meetings where decisions about the estate were made. At first she sat quietly listening. Then Margaret asked her opinion on something and she gave it. Soon she was asked again and again. Before anyone quite realized it had happened, she had become one of the women whom Margaret consulted on important matters. It was during this time that the first letter arrived from William. The messenger came on a grey afternoon in late spring, riding a horse that was lathered with sweat. He brought with him news and letters, and all the women gathered in the great hall to hear what tidings he carried. The messenger was a young man, perhaps 20, with the weather-beaten look of someone who had been travelling hard for weeks. The knights reached the coast safely, he announced. They have embarked on ships bound for the Holy Land. The passage was swift and without incident. God favours the righteous. There was a murmur of relief through the assembly. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, not happiness exactly, but a release of the tension that had been building. At least they were alive. At least for now, there was no news of death or disaster. The messenger distributed the letters, and Eleanor received a packet addressed in William's careful hand. She broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. His handwriting was large and somewhat childish, the writing of a man who had never needed to write much, and therefore never became truly skilled at it. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, and already she could feel the distance in the words, the way they seemed to be written to an idea of her rather than to her actual self. "I write to you from the harbour at Marseille, where we prepare to depart for the East. The journey was long but filled with purpose. Every mile brings us closer to our righteous destiny. I think often of you and of young Edward. Raise him to be a man of honour and strength. I shall return to you when God wills it, bearing glory and perhaps wealth besides. Pray for me as I pray for you, your devoted husband, William." Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Each reading revealed less content than the previous, until finally she understood that there was no actual content to reveal. William had written what men were expected to write in such circumstances: reassurances he could not guarantee, promises about a future he could not control, instructions about raising a son he would not be present to help raise. She found herself wondering if other women, reading their own letters, experienced the same sense of emptiness, the same feeling of being addressed from across a chasm that was growing wider with each word. But there was practical information embedded in the letter as well. William had arranged for a stipend to be paid to Eleanor from his holdings, sufficient to keep her and Edward in reasonable comfort. The money would come through the bishop's office, transferred quarterly. It was a generous provision, she supposed, though it also meant that William was thinking of her in the past tense, making arrangements as if his life was already a memory rather than an ongoing reality. Eleanor folded the letter and put it away. She did not show it to the other women, though she knew that Margaret had received a similar missive from her brother, and that others had received letters as well. Some of the letters were more affectionate, others more distant, but all of them carried the same underlying message. The men were gone, and they would not be back in any meaningful sense. They had left behind their wives with pocket money and instructions, and now those wives had to figure out what to do with their lives. The summer came, and Eleanor taught Edward to ride. He was only 4 years old, very small for a horse, but she put him on the gentlest mare in the stable and walked alongside him, her hand always on his back or his leg, ready to catch him if he slipped. The stablemaster, an old man named Robert, watched this for several days without saying anything. Then one morning he approached Eleanor while she was preparing for the lesson. "The boy should ride the pony," he said. "The one we keep for teaching. It's more suitable for his size." Eleanor had been about to argue, but then she saw something in Robert's face, a reluctant recognition that things were changing and that he was going to have to accept it. He was being kind, really, offering his expertise in a way that would work better for Edward. She accepted his suggestion gratefully, and the riding lessons improved. This became a pattern. The older men who had served under the knights slowly began to accept that their expertise and their guidance were now needed in service to women. It was not always graceful, and it was not always without resistance. The head gardener, for instance, was scandalized when Margaret asked him to explain his plans for expanding the vegetable gardens. He seemed to believe that suggesting innovations to a woman was somehow a violation of natural law, but Margaret simply asked questions until he realized that explaining his plans to her was really no different from explaining them to anyone else, and that her understanding of the potential benefits meant that his ideas might actually be implemented, which was more than the absent lord had ever done. The autumn of that year, Eleanor made her first independent decision as a woman of authority. The situation arose from a practical problem. The granary was infested with rats, and the grain was beginning to spoil. The head of the stores came to Margaret about it, expecting instructions. Margaret in turn asked Eleanor for her thoughts. Eleanor, who had been quietly observing how decisions were made all summer, spoke up. "We need to bring in cats," she said. "Enough cats to hunt the rats. We should get them from the village. The merchant there usually has several that he's been trying to place." "Cats are unreliable," said the head of stores, a man named John who had held the position for many years. "They wander, they don't obey, they may not focus on the rats." "Then we should get many cats," Eleanor replied. "More than we think we'll need. Some will wander, but some will stay. Some will hunt, even if not all of them do. And in the meantime, we can move the grain to the secondary storage building, which is cleaner while we repair and clean the main granary." Margaret looked at Eleanor with something like surprise, then nodded slowly. "That seems sensible," she said. "John, arrange it." The solution worked. Within a month, the rat infestation was controlled, the grain was saved, and Eleanor had learned something fundamental about how power actually functioned. It wasn't about having the answers, it was about having the confidence to speak, the permission to have opinions, and the trust of the people around you to implement your ideas. She had all three things now, at least in the small circles where she moved. That winter was harsh, with snow that came early and stayed long. The castle was cold, and provisions ran low as they entered the deep months of the year. But the careful planning and preparation that Margaret and Eleanor had done earlier in the autumn paid off. They had enough fuel, enough food, enough resources to survive comfortably. The castle folk knew that they were being cared for, and this knowledge created a kind of stability that Eleanor suspected had been absent for years, even when the Lord was present. When a man rules only through force and distant authority, the people under his rule are always anxious, always uncertain. But when a woman rules through careful planning and genuine concern for the welfare of those she oversees, something shifts. The anxiety doesn't disappear entirely, but it transforms into something more manageable, a willingness to work together, to problem solve, to make the system succeed. By the end of that first year, Eleanor realized that she had not seriously considered William's return in weeks. The letters came occasionally, a few each year, carried by merchants and messengers passing through. They contained the details of distant battles, descriptions of holy sites, expressions of continued faith in divine purpose. But they no longer felt like communications from a husband. They felt like missives from another world, written by a stranger who happened to share her surname. She began to reshape her life around the reality of her actual circumstances, rather than the fantasy of her husband's return. She took a larger role in the management of the estate. She began to learn about contracts and agreements, about how to negotiate with the bishop and with neighboring lords, about how to keep accurate records and plan for future needs. Margaret was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough, and seemed genuinely pleased to pass along knowledge that she had been forced to learn through necessity. One afternoon in the second year, Margaret called Eleanor to her private chamber. "I'm growing old," Margaret said without preamble. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the valley beyond the castle walls. "I won't live forever. When I'm gone, there will be a question about who leads. The bishop will expect to appoint someone, likely a distant relation of the Lord's family, some man who will come here and undo everything we've built. Unless—" "Unless?" Eleanor asked, though she thought she understood. "Unless there is already a clear structure in place, a system that works so well that dismantling it would cause more disruption than maintaining it would. Unless the people here are so accustomed to being led competently that they would resist being led incompetently." Eleanor understood what Margaret was saying, but she also understood what she wasn't saying directly, that Eleanor was being groomed, prepared, positioned. It was a relief and a burden simultaneously. "I don't know if I'm capable," Eleanor said. "No one is capable until they are," Margaret replied. "But I believe you have the qualities required. You listen before you speak. You consider the welfare of others. You're not afraid of practical problems. Those are the things that matter." Margaret died in her sleep 3 years after William's departure. She was 70 years old, and Eleanor believed that she simply decided she had lived long enough, that she had accomplished what she needed to accomplish, and that her body could now rest. The women at the castle grieved genuinely. Margaret had been respected and in her way loved, but they also seemed to accept, without any explicit announcement having been made, that Eleanor had become the centre around which the castle now revolved. The bishop was perplexed when he arrived for Margaret's funeral, to find that Eleanor had already taken charge of arrangements, already made decisions about the redistribution of responsibilities, already begun implementing small changes that suggested she saw no reason to wait for male approval before acting. He was an old man himself, accustomed to women deeding to male authority, and he seemed genuinely unsure how to respond to a woman who simply went about doing necessary work. "There must be a proper administrator," he said finally, in the tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "A man of appropriate rank to manage the Lord's holdings during his absence." "And where would we find such a man?" Eleanor asked politely. "My lord left us no steward, no representative. The knight appointed to manage things is himself on crusade. All the men of any rank in the region have their own holdings to manage. I could send to the city, but it would take months to get anyone here, and in the meantime the estate would suffer from lack of leadership, whereas I am here now, and the estate prospers." It was not an argument that could be easily countered. The bishop could have insisted, could have used the weight of the church to force the matter, but it would have required more energy and attention than he wanted to spend on a remote estate that was, after all, functioning perfectly well. He gave his blessing to Eleanor's continued stewardship with a grumbling grace and went back to the city, where he could concern himself with matters that seemed more important to the church than the internal management of a castle. Eleanor was 23 years old. She was in possession of an entire estate. She had neither husband nor father nor brother to constrain her choices. She had authority, and she had the support of the women around her, who had begun to recognize that having a capable female leader was better than almost any alternative they could imagine. The second decade of the men's absence brought new challenges and new opportunities. Other estates, having heard of the prosperity of this one, began to ask Eleanor for advice. Neighboring lords wanted to negotiate with her about boundaries and rights. The bishop, having established that Eleanor was capable and unlikely to rebel against proper authority, began to assign additional responsibilities to her, trusting her to manage them. Eleanor hired men to do the work that had always been done by men, but she hired them on her terms, and she made it clear that she was the authority they answered to. Most of them accepted this without serious resistance. Times were changing, and practical competence was coming to matter more than the gender of the person demonstrating it. It was during this period that Eleanor began to understand something that would become a central organizing principle of her leadership. The women who served in any capacity at the castle were not actually incapable of doing work. They had simply been told that they were. They had been taught that certain tasks were beneath them or above them or impossible for them, and they had believed these teachings. But when Eleanor, from a position of undeniable authority, told them that they could learn to read accounts, to manage servants, to negotiate prices with merchants, to plan for seasons and disasters, they learned. Women who had been illiterate became fluent in numbers. Women who had been frightened of making decisions began to manage entire systems of work. It was as if, Eleanor sometimes thought, she had turned a key that had been in the lock all along, and a door that was supposed to be sealed had swung open. By the end of the second decade, a generation had begun to grow up in a world where their mothers worked, where women made decisions, where female authority was simply a fact of existence rather than an anomaly. Eleanor's son Edward, now in his 20s, had never known a world in which women deferred to men on matters of importance. He had been raised by Eleanor and educated by tutors she had hired. He understood accounts and negotiations as naturally as he understood riding and sword work. Letters continued to arrive from William, now increasingly infrequent. He was older, the letters said. He had been injured and healed, injured again, and healed again. The crusade was ongoing, would always be ongoing, because faith and righteousness could never be finally satisfied. He asked about Edward in general terms, but didn't seem to expect detailed answers. Eleanor wrote back occasionally, maintaining the fiction of wifedom while conducting her life as if she were not married at all. Then, in the 23rd year after the knight's departure, a letter arrived that changed everything. It came from William's brother, written in a shaking hand that suggested the writer was either very old or very ill. William had been killed in a skirmish outside Jerusalem. He had fought bravely and died in the name of God, which the letter writer seemed to believe was some kind of consolation. William's body, the letter continued, would not be recovered. He would be buried where he fell, in that distant land that he had been convinced was worth everything. Eleanor read the letter in her private chamber, with the door closed. She read it once, then twice, then a third time. She waited to feel something. Grief, shock, relief, anger. What she felt instead was a strange kind of completion, as if something that had been suspended in incompleteness for more than 2 decades had finally resolved itself into finality. William was dead. She was no longer waiting. There was no return to hope for, no distant possibility that would eventually arrive and disrupt her life. William had achieved his purpose, had died in his holy war, had become a memory, and Eleanor had become a woman of power in her own right, through necessity and work and the simple fact that she had been present and capable and willing to act. She kept the letter to herself for 3 days before sharing it with the others. When she finally told them, the reaction was more complex than simple mourning. There was grief for William, yes, but also something else, a recognition that his death somehow solidified what had already become true in their hearts. The knights were not coming back. The world that had been promised, the one where strong men returned home and women returned to comfortable subordination, was never going to materialize. This new world, the one they had built together, was the permanent reality. Eleanor attended the memorial service that the bishop insisted on holding for William, wearing the black of mourning and maintaining the appropriate expression of sorrow. But inside, she felt a strange freedom. She was no longer divided between 2 identities, the woman she was and the wife she was supposed to be. She was simply Eleanor now, with all the power and responsibility that identity contained. The emergence of a new order. Word spread slowly throughout the region, carried by merchants and priests and the natural networks of communication that moved information from castle to manor to village to town. The women at this particular castle had effectively taken over the management of the estate in the absence of the knights. They were doing it competently, they were doing it successfully, and they showed no signs of relinquishing power when or if the knights returned. The question began to surface in conversations and concerns among the neighboring lords and among the church authorities. What did this mean? What did it mean that women could do this work? What did it mean that men had left to pursue holy war, and women had simply continued on, managing affairs, making decisions, building rather than waiting? The church, represented by a series of bishops, took various approaches to this problem. The more conservative bishops tried to assert that this was an aberration, a temporary measure that should be corrected, as soon as practical male authority could be re-established. But Eleanor received these assertions politely and then ignored them, which was a form of resistance that bishops found extremely difficult to respond to. She maintained the proper shows of deference to the church, supported the construction of a new chapel, donated generously to various causes. But she did not yield on the question of who made decisions about the estate. Over time, the bishops came to understand that attempting to remove Eleanor would create more disruption than her continued rule would. She was, after all, managing the estate with apparent competence and piety. She was not flouting church authority or promoting heresy. She was simply a capable woman in an unusual circumstance. Some of the bishops became almost friendly with her, clearly viewing her as someone who managed affairs that they themselves did not want to manage, leaving them free to pursue what they saw as more spiritual concerns. The neighboring lords took a different approach. Some attempted to take advantage, testing the boundaries, assuming that a woman-led estate would be more vulnerable to pressure or negotiation from masculine force. Eleanor responded to these tests by being unexpectedly capable in matters of defense and negotiation. She hired experienced military advisors. She made it clear that she would not be intimidated or bullied. When one lord attempted to appropriate land that belonged to her estate, she responded not with violence but with legal action through the church, documentation, and an appeal to higher authority that made it clear she understood the system of power and knew how to use it. The Lord backed down, and word spread this woman was not someone to be easily moved. Over the next few years, Eleanor began to formalize the structure that had emerged organically during the chaos of the first years after the knight's departure. She established a council of women who met regularly to discuss estate matters. The council included women from various backgrounds. Margaret's successor, a woman who had been a servant but proved to have remarkable talent for managing resources, another woman who had been the mother of one of the knights, and who brought generations of experience about family management, young women who had shown aptitude for specific kinds of work. This council made decisions collectively, though Eleanor's voice carried significant weight. They discussed the allocation of resources, the management of disputes, the planning for future needs. They were making decisions that, in a traditional feudal structure, would have been made by the lord. They were also making decisions that would never have been made in a traditional structure at all. Decisions about the welfare of the common people, about reducing the tax burden on the poorest farmers, about investing in new tools and techniques to improve agricultural productivity. The results were measurable and impressive. The estate prospered in concrete, visible ways. The stores were full. The people were healthy. There were fewer disputes and conflicts, more cooperation and mutual aid. When neighboring estates experienced bad harvests or difficulties, this estate weathered the storm with relative ease. People began to migrate to the estate, seeking work, seeking safety, seeking to be part of something that seemed to be working better than the systems they had known elsewhere. Eleanor, understanding the value of population and productivity, welcomed them. She established policies for apprenticeship, for training, for creating opportunities for capable people regardless of their family background. It was radical, though not in a way that seemed revolutionary to those living it. It was simply practical. If a person had talent and the willingness to work, it made sense to use that talent, to develop that skill, to create a role where that person could contribute to the collective prosperity. By the end of the third decade, the estate had transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. The buildings were larger and better maintained. The fields were more productive, thanks to new techniques that Eleanor had learned about from correspondence with other estate managers and had implemented. The population had grown. The people seemed more content, more invested in the success of their community. But perhaps the most profound changes were the ones that were invisible to a casual observer. They existed in the minds and hearts of the women and men who lived there, in their understanding of what was possible, in their sense of their own agency and capability. Eleanor was no longer the only woman making significant decisions. She had consciously worked to distribute power among the women she trusted, ensuring that no single person was irreplaceable, that the system could function even if something happened to her. Young women were being trained in management, in negotiation, in the care of accounts and people. Men were being trained as well, but in a different way. They were being trained to take direction from women, to execute decisions made by councils that included female voices, to accept authority that came from competence rather than from the simple fact of being male. This was, Eleanor understood, one of the most radical changes of all. It touched something deeper than mere management structure. It touched the fundamental assumptions about the order of the world. There was resistance to this, particularly among the older men who had grown up in the old system and struggled to accept the new one. But Eleanor had learned through observation of Margaret that resistance could often be overcome simply by continuing to behave as if the new order was already established and would not be changed. You simply acted as if the woman leading the council was the natural order of things, and eventually people accepted it, because maintaining that acceptance was less exhausting than constantly resisting. The second generation, 25 years after the knight's departure, Edward, Eleanor's son, reached manhood. He had been educated carefully by Eleanor, trained not just in the military arts that were traditionally taught to sons of the nobility, but in the new forms of power that Eleanor had learned to exercise. He could read accounts better than most merchants. He understood negotiation. He had been present at council meetings since he was old enough to sit quietly and observe, and he understood the principles and practices of distributed leadership. When he reached adulthood, Eleanor faced a decision. In a traditional feudal structure, Edward would have been the heir, the future lord. He could, if he wished, assert authority based on his sex and his bloodline. Eleanor wondered sometimes what he would choose to do. She raised the question directly with him one spring afternoon as they rode together through the estate's lands, inspecting the improvements that had been made to the water systems that served the mills. "You're going to have to decide," she said to him, "whether you want to lead or whether you want to support someone else's leadership. I cannot make that decision for you." Edward was quiet for a long moment. He was a young man now, with his father's dark coloring, but something in his face that was entirely his own, a kind of thoughtful wariness that suggested he understood complexity. "Would the people accept me leading?" he asked. "Some would, simply because you are male and of appropriate bloodline," Eleanor replied. "Some would resist, because they've come to trust the current system. Some would accept you if you continued the current system, and resisted you if you tried to change it." "What do you want me to do?" Edward asked. Eleanor smiled slightly. "I want you to do what is right. But I suspect those are different things for different people. I want you to do what feels true to you, what you believe will serve the people best. I want you to live your life as your own person, not as someone else's extension." Edward turned this over in his mind as they rode, considering the fields and the people working in them, the mills turning with water from the improved channels, the evidence of the system that Eleanor had built. "I think," he said finally, "that I want to marry a capable woman and share the leading of this place with her. I think the system you've built is better than what came before, and I don't want to be the person who destroys it just because I can. I want to improve it, maybe, if I can see ways to improve it, but not destroy it." Eleanor felt something settle inside her, a sense that she had done something right in the way she had raised her son, that she had managed to convey to him the possibility that power could be used differently than the models he had inherited would suggest. "Then you need to think carefully about who you marry," Eleanor said, "because leadership of a shared kind requires partnership at its deepest level. You'll need someone who understands what we're building and wants to be part of building it." Edward smiled. "I think I've already found her. Her name was Catherine, and she was the daughter of a merchant from the nearby town. She had been educated by her father in matters of trade and accounts, an unusual circumstance that had resulted from her father's lack of sons, and his pragmatic decision that it was better to teach his intelligent daughter than to leave his business to distant male relations. She had come to the estate initially as a guest, brought by a friend, and had spent an afternoon in conversation with Eleanor about the management of resources and the practical problems of scaling production. Eleanor had liked her immediately, recognizing in her a kindred spirit, a woman who understood that competence was its own kind of power, that interesting problems were worth solving regardless of one's sex, that the world was full of possibilities if one had the courage to imagine them. When Edward mentioned his interest in marrying Catherine, Eleanor's first response was to wonder if this was something Catherine had agreed to, or something Edward was merely hoping for. She made discreet inquiries and discovered that Catherine seemed equally interested in Edward, which was more than half the battle in matters of marriage. The marriage took place 2 years later, in a ceremony that was attended by representatives from the bishop's office, by neighbouring lords, by merchants from the towns, and by the common people of the estate, who had come to view such occasions as their own celebrations. It was a grand affair, but also different from what a traditional wedding would have been. Eleanor and Catherine's father both walked the bride to the altar. The ceremony itself included, at Eleanor's insistence, a public exchange of vows not just about obedience and childbearing, but about partnership and shared purpose. After the wedding, Catherine settled into the castle and began the process of learning the systems and structures that Eleanor had built. She was quick to understand, curious about the reasoning behind the decisions that had been made, eager to see how she might contribute. Within months, she was attending council meetings and making suggestions. Within a year, she had become indispensable. Eleanor watched this transition with a kind of satisfied completion. She had built something that could now operate without her, could evolve and improve under the guidance of a new generation. She was only in her early 50s, but she felt ancient in the way that people sometimes do when they have completed a great work and can finally rest. She began to withdraw gradually from direct management, leaving more decisions to Edward and Catherine, attending council meetings less frequently, spending more time with books and correspondence. She had become something of a scholar without quite intending to, reading everything she could find about estate management, about the governance of cities, about philosophy and theology, and the fundamental questions of how people ought to live together. She began to correspond with other women who found themselves in similar positions, managing estates in the absence of men, learning to make decisions, navigating the complex world of power and influence. Some of these women were in the same situation as Eleanor had been, widows of crusaders or knights on long campaigns. Others were governing estates because their husbands had died, or because they had inherited from their fathers, or because they had simply been capable and necessary, and no one had objected. Through this correspondence, Eleanor discovered that she was not alone in what she was building, that similar transformations were happening in scattered locations throughout Europe. Wherever women found themselves in positions of necessity and authority, it was a kind of silent revolution, Eleanor realized. There were no proclamations, no manifestos, no grand declarations of change. There was simply the quiet, practical work of capable women, solving problems because problems had to be solved, making decisions because decisions had to be made. And gradually, imperceptibly, the world was changing. The third decade and beyond, by the 40th year after the knight's departure, the estate had become something almost unrecognizable from what it had been in the old days. The structures of power had transformed entirely. Women held positions of significant authority in every part of the system. The council that made major decisions was composed of 7 people. Eleanor, now mostly advisory, Edward, Catherine, 3 other women whose expertise and judgment had earned them places, and 1 man whose skills in managing the affairs with neighboring estates had proven invaluable. The fact that 4 of these 7 were women was no longer remarkable to those living within the system. It had simply become the way things were done. But to outside observers, particularly those who visited from more traditional estates or from the cities where older forms of power still held sway, it was shocking. Eleanor received visitors from time to time who seemed unable to process what they were seeing. Women working in positions of authority, men taking direction from women, decisions being made collaboratively rather than through the assertion of male dominance. Eleanor would host these visitors courteously, show them around the estate, allow them to observe the council meetings. Some of them left scandalized, convinced that something deeply wrong was happening that would eventually lead to chaos and ruin. Others left thoughtful, wondering whether perhaps their own assumptions about the proper order of things might be worth examining. The practical results spoke for themselves, however. The estate was prosperous. The people living there were healthy, reasonably content, and invested in the success of the community. There was less crime than in comparable regions. There were lower rates of infant mortality, better nutrition, more opportunity for advancement, based on merit rather than on birth. These were not accidents. They were the direct results of deliberate policies pursued by Eleanor and her successors, policies that had been designed with the welfare of all the people in mind rather than with the singular goal of extracting maximum wealth from the land. It was during this period that Eleanor began to think seriously about the question of legacy, not legacy in the sense of monuments or memorials. Such things seemed unimportant to her, but legacy in the sense of ensuring that the systems she had built would outlast her, would continue to evolve and improve in the hands of future generations. She began to document, in careful handwriting on expensive parchment, the principles and practices that had emerged over the decades. She wrote about decision-making processes, about how to evaluate people's capabilities fairly, about the importance of listening to those who were actually doing the work, about the necessity of maintaining both order and flexibility. She wrote about how to manage resources sustainably, how to invest in future productivity, how to balance the needs of the present with the needs of generations to come. Some of this documentation was practical, lists of which crops grew best in which fields, notes on improvements to agricultural techniques, records of successful negotiations with neighboring lords, but much of it was more philosophical, reflecting Eleanor's thinking about why the system worked and what principles should guide future leaders in making decisions that she herself would not be present to. And the question will always come, she wrote, of whether to maintain the systems as they have been established or to change them to meet new circumstances. My answer is that they should be changed when change is necessary, but that changes should be made slowly and with careful consideration of the consequences. The system itself is less important than the principles behind it, that decisions should be made by those who understand the actual circumstances, that the welfare of all people matters more than the privileges of the few. That power should be used in service of collective benefit rather than individual aggrandizement. She also wrote extensively about the relationship between men and women, trying to articulate something she had learned through decades of experience. The old order, she wrote, was based on the assumption that men were naturally suited to leadership and women naturally suited to subordination. I have found this to be false. Some men are capable leaders and some are not. The same is true of women. What appears to be natural often turns out to be merely habitual. We are capable of being trained into patterns of subordination and equally capable of being trained into patterns of authority. The question is not what we are naturally suited for, but what we choose to become. By her 70s, Eleanor was spending most of her time on this documentation, on corresponding with other women who were in positions of leadership, on thinking and writing about the larger questions of how human societies ought to be organized. She had become something of a wise woman, someone whom people sought out when they faced difficult decisions, someone whose judgment was trusted because it had been tested repeatedly over decades and found to be sound. She was also, though she would never have used the word herself, a revolutionary. She had not intended to be. She had simply been responding to circumstances, doing what needed to be done, adapting as situations changed. But the cumulative effect of those adaptations had been to fundamentally alter the structure of power in her world. She had demonstrated, through sustained success over many decades, that women could lead, that societies organized on principles of collective wisdom rather than hierarchical dominance could function effectively, that the old order was not inevitable or unchangeable, but rather a choice. One choice among many possibilities. The long, quiet transformation. By the time Eleanor died, at the age of 83, the transformation she had initiated had spread far beyond her own estate. Other women in similar circumstances had heard about what she was doing and had begun to emulate some of her approaches. Not all of them went as far as Eleanor had. Many compromised between the old systems and the new, maintaining male authority in form while ceding it in practice to capable women. But the possibility had been opened. The idea had been planted. The seeds of change had been scattered. Eleanor's death was marked by 3 days of mourning at the castle. The bishop came to preside over the funeral, and he spoke of her service to the church and to the community. But he did not and could not fully capture what she had been to the people who lived under her leadership. She had been something more than a manager or an administrator. She had been a model of what was possible. Evidence that the world could be organized differently than it had been organized. Proof that women could think and decide and lead and do so effectively. After her death, Edward and Catherine took on fuller leadership of the estate, but they did not dismantle or fundamentally alter the systems that Eleanor had built. They modified them, improved them, adapted them to new circumstances. They made decisions that Eleanor might have made differently, but they did so using the frameworks and principles that Eleanor had established. The system proved resilient and flexible enough to accommodate different personalities and different visions while maintaining its essential character. The next generation, Edward and Catherine's children, grew up in a world where they had never been taught that women were less capable than men, where they had never absorbed the lessons of subordination that Eleanor's generation had had to unlearn. For them, the idea that women could lead was simply a fact of their world, no more remarkable than the fact that men could. Some of them became leaders, some did not, based on capability and choice rather than gender. More significantly, they began to think about the question that Eleanor had raised without quite answering. If women could lead effectively, if the old order was not inevitable, then what did that mean for the structure of society more broadly? What else might be possible if people questioned the assumptions they had been taught to take for granted? It would take centuries for these questions to fully permeate through the broader society. In many places, the old order would persist, maintained by force and custom and the weight of tradition. But in other places, other Eleanors would arise. Women who found themselves in positions of necessity and who chose to use that necessity to build something different. Slowly, over the course of generations, the ideas that Eleanor had embodied would begin to spread more widely. Women would begin to assert the right to education, to property, to participation in governance. The old order would be challenged, resisted, sometimes defeated, sometimes merely compromised with. None of this would happen quickly. Progress would be painfully slow, marked by periods of regression and backlash. There would be centuries in which the gains that had been made would be partially undone, in which women would once again be told that they were inherently incapable of leading, in which the structures of male dominance would reassert themselves over and over, but the seed had been planted. Once it had been demonstrated that things could be organized differently, that women could be effective leaders, that societies could function and indeed flourish under systems that did not depend on male dominance. It became impossible to make the old arguments stick with the same kind of absolute conviction. There would always be women in every era who would remember or learn that Eleanor had done what she did, that systems could be organized differently, that the world was not as fixed and unchangeable as they were being told it was. The untold stories, most of what happened at the castle in those decades after the knight's departure, would never be formally recorded in chronicles or histories. This was partly because much of the work was quiet and daily, too mundane to attract the attention of the monks who wrote the official accounts of their times. It was partly because the men who might have felt motivated to record these events, the ecclesiastical authorities, the neighboring lords, did not perceive what was happening as particularly significant until long after it had already transformed the world it was part of. But the forgetting was also deliberate, in a way. In the centuries after Eleanor's life, as the structures of power gradually solidified again, as male dominance reasserted itself as the natural order of things, the stories of women like Eleanor became inconvenient. They were inconvenient because they suggested possibilities that challenged the legitimacy of the existing order. If Eleanor could lead effectively, if women could make decisions and build systems that worked, then the arguments for excluding women from power became harder to defend. It was easier to simply forget that Eleanor had existed, to not pass down the stories, to allow them to fade into obscurity. This is how history works for those who are not part of the dominant narrative. Their stories are forgotten, not by accident, but by a kind of willful erasure that is built into the systems that decide what gets recorded and what gets left out. Eleanor's own writings survived, preserved in the library of the castle, and later in ecclesiastical archives, but they were not widely circulated or seriously studied. They were kept but not honored, preserved but not remembered. It is only in much later eras, when different questions began to be asked, and people started to look for answers about whether women could lead and how societies organized around female authority might function, that scholars began to rediscover Eleanor's writings and to piece together the story of what she and the women around her had accomplished. But even then, the story was often told incompletely, with the achievement minimized or explained away as somehow exceptional, as if Eleanor had been an unusual woman in unusual circumstances, rather than a woman who had responded intelligently to the circumstances available to her. The assumptions that made her story so shocking, the assumption that women are inherently unsuited to leadership, that male authority is natural and inevitable, were so deeply embedded in the culture that even when confronted with evidence to the contrary, people often found ways to explain it away. Some writers suggested that Eleanor had been able to lead effectively only because the extraordinary circumstances of her situation, the absence of all the men, had created a kind of vacuum that she had been forced to fill. They suggested that in normal times, with properly organized male authority present, such a woman would have been crushed or constrained. This argument misses something essential, however. Eleanor's leadership was not something that happened by accident or because of circumstance. It was something that she built deliberately, day by day, decision by decision, principle by principle. And once built, it could not be easily dismantled. Others who came after her could learn from what she had done and could apply similar principles in different contexts. The story of Eleanor and the women of her estate is, in many ways, the story of how human societies actually change. It is not through grand proclamations or revolutionary violence, though those can play a role. It is through the quiet, patient work of people who respond to necessity by reimagining what is possible, who demonstrate through sustained practice that things can be organized differently, who build new systems that work so well that it becomes harder to go back to the old ways. What makes Eleanor's story important is not that it was unique. It was not. Similar transformations were happening, in various forms in many places throughout medieval and early modern Europe. What makes it important is that it demonstrates something fundamental, that the subordination of women was not biological or inevitable, but rather a choice that societies had made, a system that could be maintained only as long as people accepted it as normal and natural. The women who lived at the castle in those decades after the knight's departure had not set out to revolutionize the organization of society. They had simply been trying to solve immediate practical problems. How do you manage an estate when the man who is supposed to be managing it is absent? How do you make decisions when the people who are usually supposed to make decisions are not available? How do you care for children and maintain order and plan for the future when the usual systems are no longer in place? But in solving these practical problems, they discovered something profound, that women were capable of doing all the things that men had told them they could not do. They could manage estates. They could make decisions. They could negotiate with powerful men and hold their own. They could understand complex systems of finance and agriculture and governance. They could lead. This discovery, once made, could not be undiscovered. Even after Eleanor died, even after new systems of male dominance reasserted themselves in some places, the fact remained that these women had done what they had done, and evidence of their success could not be completely erased. Future generations of women, facing similar circumstances or even different circumstances, could point to Eleanor and say, "This was done before. This is possible." The specific systems that Eleanor built would change and evolve, would be adapted and modified by those who came after. But the fundamental principle, that women were capable of leading, that societies organized around principles of collective wisdom and shared decision-making could function effectively, that the old order was not inevitable. This principle had been established and could be built upon. In the generations immediately after Eleanor's death, her estate continued to prosper and to serve as a kind of model for how things might be organized differently. Other women in leadership positions, particularly those who were widows or who had inherited estates in their own right, began to adopt some of her practices. Not all of them, and not all women in all places, but enough that a slow transformation began to occur in the practical reality of how power was exercised. Even as the formal structures of male dominance remained officially in place, there were setbacks and resistances. There were periods in which the old order reasserted itself with renewed force, in which women who had held power were pushed out, in which the gains that had been made seemed to be lost. But the possibility remained open. The knowledge remained somewhere in the culture that things could be organized differently. Looking at the history of Eleanor's life and times from a much later perspective, we can see her as a figure caught in a much larger historical arc. The Middle Ages, the period in which she lived, are often characterized as a time of rigid hierarchy, of stagnation, of unchanging social structures maintained by force and tradition. But this characterization is too simple. Even within the rigid hierarchies of the feudal system, there was room for change, for adaptation, for people to improvise new solutions to new problems. Eleanor lived in a moment when the usual systems had broken down. The knights were gone, and the assumption that male authority would be constantly present and available to make decisions had proven false. Into this gap stepped women who were capable and necessary, and who simply continued the work that needed to be done. They did not see themselves as revolutionaries. They were simply being practical. But practicality, sustained over time and proven successful, becomes power. And power, once demonstrated, cannot be argued away. The intellectual movements of the Renaissance that would eventually challenge many medieval assumptions about the natural order were still centuries in the future. But the seeds of those challenges were being planted in places like Eleanor's estate, in the quiet recognition that the world could be organized differently, that women were capable of thinking and leading and deciding, that the old hierarchies were not as natural and inevitable as they seemed. The Protestant Reformation, when it came, would challenge the authority of the Church in ways that Eleanor, a pious woman who worked within ecclesiastical structures, could not have imagined. The Enlightenment would bring new ideas about reason and natural rights that would eventually be applied to questions of gender, though not without great resistance. The industrial and scientific revolutions would transform the material conditions of human life. But through all of these transformations, the basic question would remain: are women truly incapable of leading, thinking, deciding? Or is that simply what we have been told? For Eleanor and the women of her time, the answer came through practice rather than philosophy, through demonstration rather than argument. They showed by doing what was possible, and that showing could not be completely undone by later generations who wanted to pretend it had never happened. The story of Eleanor is also the story of the other women at the castle, whose names have been lost to history, but whose lives were just as significant as Eleanor's in building the new order. There was Catherine, Eleanor's daughter-in-law, who proved to be an even more gifted administrator than Eleanor herself, who expanded the systems Eleanor had built and made them more efficient and just. There was Agnes, one of the older servants who had learned to read accounts and who eventually became the chief manager of the estate's finances, a position of significant responsibility and respect. There was Beatrice, the widow of one of the knights, who had initially been lost in grief, but who had eventually found purpose in teaching the younger women to read and write, creating a tradition of literacy that would persist for generations. These women, and hundreds of others whose names were never recorded, but whose work was essential to building the new order, deserve to be remembered and honored. They were not heroes in the dramatic sense. They did not fight great battles or perform miracles. But they were heroes in a deeper sense. They were ordinary women who faced circumstances they had not chosen, who rose to meet the challenges of those circumstances, who built something new and better out of the fragments of an old world that had been shattered by distant wars and absent men. Their lives demonstrate something that is often forgotten in the telling of history, that great transformations are usually built not by exceptional individuals, but by many ordinary people doing their ordinary work in slightly different ways. Eleanor did not single-handedly transform the estate or the world. She was a catalyst for change, a person with particular capabilities and circumstances and choices. But the actual work of transformation was done by hundreds of people, most of them women, most of them forgotten, who learned to do things they had been told they could not do, who proved through their daily work that the old assumptions were false. When we ask what Eleanor's legacy was, we need to be careful not to overstate it. The medieval world did not transform into an egalitarian paradise because of what happened in one estate, or even in several estates. Male dominance persisted as the dominant model of power for centuries after Eleanor's death. Many of the gains that were made were subsequently lost. The subordination of women would remain deeply embedded in the structures of European and Western society for centuries to come. But it is also true that the seed had been planted. The possibility had been demonstrated. There existed, in the historical record and in the cultural memory, evidence that things could be organized differently, that women could lead, that the old order was not inevitable. This evidence would resurface at various moments in history when different people asked similar questions and went looking for answers. When women in the 18th and 19th centuries began to organize for rights and suffrage and education, they did not have Eleanor's specific story to draw on. Her life had been largely forgotten by then, but they had the same basic knowledge that Eleanor had embodied, that women were capable of doing things that society told them they could not do, that the restrictions placed on women were not natural, but rather social constructions that could be challenged and changed. When 20th century feminists began to ask the question, what if things were organized entirely differently? They were, in a sense, asking the same question that Eleanor and her contemporaries had been forced to ask in their own time. What is actually possible when we stop assuming the old hierarchies are inevitable? Eleanor's story, then, is part of a much longer story about the gradual transformation of human societies, about the slow and painful process of reimagining what is possible and fighting to make those new possibilities actual. It is not a story of triumph exactly, because the victory was incomplete and temporary, because much of what was gained was lost and would have to be won again. But it is a story of possibility, of demonstration, of women proving through their actions that the world their societies had told them was natural and inevitable was, in fact, constructed and changeable. One of the most painful aspects of Eleanor's story is how completely she was forgotten. She lived to be an old woman, respected and influential in her time. She saw the systems she had built take root and flourish. She trained successors who would continue her work. And then, in the years after her death, as the historical record was written by others with different priorities and assumptions, her story gradually faded from view. This erasure was not accidental. It was built into the systems that decided what stories were worth telling, what lives were worth recording, what knowledge was worth preserving. The church, the nobility, the men who had the power to create the official narratives of history, they had little motivation to celebrate and preserve the stories of women, who had used necessity as an opportunity to challenge the foundations of male authority. So, Eleanor's writings were filed away in archives. The stories of her leadership were gradually forgotten or transformed into anecdotes about an exceptional woman in exceptional circumstances, rather than being understood as evidence of what women in general were capable of. The systems she had built were gradually dismantled or transformed back into more traditional hierarchies, as new generations of male authority reasserted themselves. This pattern of forgetting has been repeated throughout history. The contributions of women to building human societies have been systematically minimized, forgotten, or reframed as exceptional rather than as evidence of female capability. Women have done essential work, have managed estates and cities and households and economies, have made decisions that affected the lives of thousands, have led and organized and thought and created, and that work has been recorded, if at all, only to be later forgotten or attributed to men. Eleanor's story is important precisely because it represents so many forgotten stories. She is, in a sense, standing in for all the women whose names have been lost, whose work has been erased, whose contributions have been forgotten or minimized. Her story is a reminder that the history we have been told is incomplete, that there are entire categories of human experience and achievement that have been left out of the official narratives, that the world has been shaped by people and forces that do not appear in the chronicles. One of the most striking aspects of Eleanor's story is how familiar it feels, even to modern readers. The basic dynamic, women being told they are incapable of leadership, women rising to leadership when circumstances require it and proving their capability, women's achievements being forgotten or minimized in the historical record. This pattern has repeated itself countless times throughout history and continues to repeat itself in the present day. Women have been told for centuries that they lack the capacity for certain kinds of work. And in each era, when circumstances have forced the issue, women have been able to do that work. During wars, women have managed economies. When men have been absent or unavailable, women have led. When society has been in crisis, women have organized and solved problems. And in each case, the initial surprise, women can do this, has gradually been replaced by historical amnesia and a return to the assumption that women are naturally suited only to subordination. What makes Eleanor's story useful, then, is not that it is unique or unusual, but rather that it is representative. It shows us a pattern that we can then begin to recognize in other historical contexts. It helps us understand that the subordination of women was not inevitable or natural, but rather a system that has had to be constantly reinforced, that has faced constant challenges from the evidence of women's capability, that persists more through the power to control narratives than through any inherent truth about female incapability. In imagining Eleanor's life and work, we are also inevitably asking ourselves the counterfactual question, what if things had continued differently? What if, when the knights eventually returned, in our story, they never did? But in many actual historical cases they did. They had found the systems that women had built to be so effective and successful that they had chosen to maintain them. What if, instead of reasserting male dominance and dismantling female-led structures, returning men had recognized the superior functionality of the new systems and had chosen to work within them? In some historical cases, this actually happened, at least partially. In some regions and time periods, returning men did choose to maintain and work within the structures that women had built. This was rare, but it happened, and where it did happen, it sometimes led to more egalitarian social structures that persisted longer than the more strictly hierarchical systems that emerged in other places. It is worth imagining, for a moment, what European societies might have looked like if the transformation that began in places like Eleanor's estate had been allowed to continue and flourish. What if, instead of the reassertion of male dominance in the early modern period, we had seen the continued development of more egalitarian structures? What if women had retained the authority and capability they had demonstrated, and had used that authority to shape the development of industrial and modern societies? We cannot know, of course. History might have followed a very different path, or it might have followed a similar path with different people holding power. But it is worth imagining, worth considering the possibility, because it reminds us that the world we have been born into is not the only world that was possible. It is a specific world, created by specific choices made by specific people. And it could have been otherwise. Eleanor died in her 83rd year, having seen the transformation she initiated begin to take root in the world beyond her immediate estate. She was buried in the chapel that had been built on the estate, in a place of honor near the altar. The inscription on her tomb, written at the direction of her successor, read simply, "Here lies Eleanor, who led with wisdom and justice." It is a modest epitaph, and it does not begin to capture what she accomplished or what she embodied. But perhaps that is appropriate. Eleanor did not seek monuments or grand memorials. She sought to build systems that would outlast her, and in that she succeeded, at least for a time. The systems she built would eventually be dismantled or transformed by later generations, but not before they had proven, through decades of successful operation, that alternative ways of organizing society were possible. In her final years, Eleanor spent time writing letters to young women who wrote to her asking for advice about managing their own estates or about the problems they faced as women in positions of responsibility. She answered these letters carefully and thoughtfully, offering not so much specific instructions as general principles that she had learned through experience. "Do not be afraid," she wrote in one letter that survives in an archive. "Fear is the tool by which they maintain your subordination. Fear of making mistakes, fear of being wrong, fear of stepping outside the role you have been assigned. But mistakes are the cost of learning, and those who do not make mistakes are those who do not act. Act anyway, decide anyway, lead anyway. And eventually you will discover that you are capable of things you were told were impossible." This is the real legacy of Eleanor's life, not a specific set of systems or policies, but an example, a demonstration that things could be different, an affirmation that women were capable of far more than they were told they were capable of. This example could be forgotten, could be erased from history, but it could not be completely undone. The proof had been offered. The possibility had been demonstrated, and that possibility would continue to exist, waiting to be discovered by future generations of women who, facing their own challenges and circumstances, would ask themselves what Eleanor had asked. If the men are gone, or absent or unwilling to do what needs to be done, can I do it myself? The answer, demonstrated by Eleanor and countless other women throughout history, has always been yes.